we should hopefully get a message telling us that we have started. Richard, I will hand over to you to just get started, and I will bring in any latecomers from the wait room over the course of the presentation. Please do feel free to use the chat box, everyone, if you have burning questions that you want to not forget, but make sure that you get to ask. And just very quickly, I don't think I know either of you, Beth or Sean, so lovely to meet you. I'm Catherine McWilliam. I am the IOD Scotland Director. I'm in charge of our activity in Scotland. So thank you very much both for joining us.
Lovely
Richard,
to meet you.
Hi,
thank you. Richard Preece is our presenter for today, and he is with the OSP Cyber Academy. And I'm sure Richard will give a quick introduction to himself. So Richard, without further ado, it is over to you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Welcome. So a little bit of background about myself. I started off in this game in the army, where along the way, having walked around carrying large heavy weights, they decided they were going to train me up to be a hybrid, to understand what this new technologies that was coming in, how it could be better used, but as from a strategic perspective, from an operational perspective, as well as a technology perspective. And really, the Army used me in that role off and on for the next 10 years of my service before I left in 2012. And since then, I've been working in the consulting sector mainly, and working with a multitude of organizations, both in the UK and internationally. This training is a reflection of what I've learned throughout my career and what I observe are challenges for all organizations. And there is no universal solution, but there is ways of thinking about this and then applying the challenge and a strategy to your organization, your firm. You don't need to worry about what your competitors are doing per se. It's what works for you. And we can talk about that perhaps more as we go along. I always tend to start off with this quote from Robert Morris Sr. Robert Morris Sr., highly respected chief scientist at the US's National Security Agency, their equivalent of GCHQ, who, after he left that appointment, used to start off his talks with this. And it is really important to always bear this in mind because, and we will talk more about this as we go along, we have an inherent belief that technology is good, and it can be, but technology, all technology, is inherently flawed, and therefore you've got to start off working with that premise. Just as we know all people are inherently flawed, starting with me, all technology and the data it then uses is inherently flawed. Okay, Robert Morris Sr. features in a book I always recommend as a really good primer in this, and it's a bit of a take you back to the late 80s, called The Cuckoo's Egg. And it's the story of how a astrophysicist who lost his research funding, so was sent to the computer department to do some tasks, at the end of his first week, ended up trying to follow through what became Cold War espionage. All as a result, in those days, of a 70 cents non-reconciliation of computing power, because you paid for it literally by the minute in those days. Okay. Robert Morris Sr.'s son, Robert Morris Jr., in The Cuckoo's Egg, and subsequently, is responsible for what some people still estimate is the most expensive cyber attack in the world, in history. And that was as a postgraduate student in an Ivy League, came up with what became known as the Morris worm, as a prank on his fellow Ivy League universities and got out of hand. So when we talk about cyber being all hoodied hackers, actually we're talking about non-malicious accidents as much as the malicious sort. Robert Morris Jr. was the first person prosecuted under the US equivalent of the Computer Misuse Act. He is now a highly respected Ivy League professor in cybersecurity. So many lessons there for what this subject is about. And it is not always as obvious and as straightforward as we like to think. So what is the bottom line up front? This is really about trust. There's a technical trust, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But actually, it's, are you as company directors, as company officers, your board, your executives, your organization, are you able, in the modern world, and we're going to talk about what's changed, able to promote the success of your company, which will almost certainly involve the use of data and digital technologies in cyberspace? Are you equipped to provide independent judgment and brackets challenge? And can you demonstrate that you're providing due care, skill, and diligence in these subjects? We can all look at a spreadsheet of financials. We all have our areas of expertise within our respective organizations that we can talk with due care, skill, and diligence when we're making complex decisions. But this is everybody's business. And at board level, executive level, everyone has to be able to play their part. So everybody needs to ask themselves at the board and executive level, are you able to demonstrate that due care, skill, and diligence in a pre and post, when not if, disruptive event? That is the ultimate question, because you're the trustworthy in you as an individual and as you as a firm will be what you've done beforehand and what you do afterwards. And trust is based on three core characteristics. Are you credible by the logic and the actions that you've approached the problem? Are you authentic? Are you telling the truth? Are you acting coherently with your purpose, your vision, your values? And are you competent? Do you have the right sorts of skills to do what you need to do from a governance perspective, whether that be at board or at executive level, or your respective company members? This is a team sport. In fact, it's a team of team sports. Okay? No one knows everything, and that includes me. Everyone needs to play to their part within that. Covered a lot there in a very short space of time. Are there any questions about this? But it's really at the heart of this, and it's the deep thinking that's required when embracing this area, because there are positives and negatives, which we'll talk briefly about in a minute. Okay. So whenever we talk about strategy, everyone likes to talk about strategy. Core to any strategy is working out what's going on here. What is events and actually what's going on underneath? So what are the patterns and the trends? What will happen and what may happen? Hard trends, soft trends. Now that's central to any business strategy. And digital technologies are going to be central almost certainly to any strategy you have. So it's really important to understand what's going on here in terms of opportunity, but also in terms of potential danger that arises from that opportunity. It's not a one or the other. It's a much more complex and nuanced world. So how are things structured? How are things related, and what influences those patterns? And then what are your mental models and worldviews? We all have biases. How have your values, your assumptions, your beliefs shape that system? And actually, do you have some blind spots? Are you not necessarily challenging and asking the right question? Are you saying this is a technical issue in the all too difficult box? Let's put it over there. I don't need to do it. The IT department have got it. Because the reality is this has real world impacts, including on your business. And the deeper you go into understanding, the more strategic advantage you actually have. That applies to strategy as a whole, and it applies how cyber resilience, coupled with digital innovation, the good and the bad. Notice I've used digital's good, cyber bad. Actually, they're interchangeable. The more you understand those relationships, the greater your potential advantage. And ultimately, if you want to be thriving, not just surviving, it's good strategy that will get you a long way. And part of that good strategy is understanding what's going on here. So if you look at the core of any good strategy, you're looking for new insights. What's going on here? What's the diagnosis happening? And from that, develop coherent policies that can be implemented into coherent action. This isn't about having a nice PowerPoint. It isn't about having a nice set of posters. It's about real world action. And that action is probably going to change every day, because this is an incredibly moving, volatile, and complex environment that's changing all the time. What was good yesterday might be completely upended tomorrow. So be ready and in that mindset, because actually that's the mindset of successful businesses anyway in the modern world. So where are the opportunities in the digital age? What are the trends? Well, let's talk a little about exponential technologies and the age we are now in. And I'll explain this with a simple analogy. So legend has it that the inventor of chess in 6th century India, when the emperor of the Gupta Empire was given this marvelous game, he said, "How can I reward you?" And he said, "What I would like is to place 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard. I would then like you to double it, and then double it, and double it, and double it, and keep on doubling." Now, if you were to do that, by the time you're about halfway along the second row, you go from a grain of rice to putting a bowl of rice. You've got something you can actually do something with. You can feed yourself for a meal. By the time you reach halfway, 32nd square, you've got a field of rice being placed on that 1 square. So not only can you do something, you can feed yourself for 1 day, you can actually start feeding yourself for a more sustainable period. If you went on to the 64th square, you would have more rice than has ever been produced. It would be higher than Mount Everest. Needless to say, the emperor didn't fulfill the bargain. But that is understanding exponential curves. And technology has been on an exponential curve really since the 1940s, but let's take it from 1958, the first year the US Economic Census Bureau first recorded IT expenditure. Pretty basic. 1965, we had Moore's Law. So Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, came up with a very famous technology law that said roughly every 18 months, 2 years, we will halve the price to produce double the computing power. And he thought that would last for about 10 years. Well, we're just about hit the end now. But by 1976, we were at the stage of a bowl of rice. And it was around that period that we had the Israelis do, you may recall, the Entebbe hostage raid, where they rescued some hijacked Israeli hostages that had been taken to Uganda and Entebbe airport. The current Prime Minister of Israel's brother was the only Israeli military casualty on that, or fatality on that, leading the Special Forces Group. Why is that important? Well, the Americans had tried a hostage rescue in 1970 that hadn't gone so well because the Soviets had worked out what was going on and warned off the Vietnamese. So when they arrived at the American prisoner of war camp, all the prisoners had been moved. And they worked out that the Israelis had been able to do some very covert rehearsals very quickly. And they said, can we do this in a digital way? So they actually funded some research, which took place over the next 5-10 years, which effectively is the basis of what I've got in my pocket now. It produced smart screens. It produced Google Glass, you know, those sort of vision glasses. It produced voice-activated software. It just wasn't very practical. But they did all the proofs of concept at that point. And so by 1990, we're beginning to see some quite large changes to IT. We've got personal computing beginning to enter. We've got the World Wide Web beginning to be rolled out. And by 97, we're beginning to get online Google being founded, AWS being founded, the world's largest supercomputer, 1.4 petabytes, covered 4 football pitches, cost about £50 million, which by 2006, the latest Sony PlayStation was producing the same computing power for $500. There you're beginning to see genuinely exponential curves. So it has gone from being a difference in degree to a difference in kind. And that's just to 2006. What we now have, and in 2006, that's when Elon Musk came out with his first plan for Tesla. 2016, he updated that. 2023, he put his latest one. And that is all based on understanding technology curves, exponential curves, and what could be done. So when I was in the army in the early mid-noughties, I was doing a strategy out to now for how we would transform based on these exponential curves. Because even though it couldn't be done today, we knew it would be able to be done because the technology was getting more powerful, more equipment. We're now in the age where artificial intelligence is beginning to have a meaningful impact and is going to increasingly do so. So it's not a case of Moore's law, and which has pretty well come to its leveling out for computer chips. It's we've got the processing power, we've got the data, and we've got the algorithms that we can now do much more inventive things. So we're recombining innovation. So by 2030, we're probably going to see the next ChatGPT costing $30 billion, latest estimates, to train, just to develop. But what it will be able to do will be exponentially probably greater than today. And this is the trend. So what are we going to be like in 2054? So when you're looking at your business and the sustainability of your business, 2030 is 2 business cycles away. How quickly, what do you need to invest in? What do you need to be thinking about now in order to grow and sustain your business? Because this technology is coming in one form or another. And that technology basically allows you to do better things and do things better. And there are power curves, what's called Wright's law, learning by doing. So the more you modularize and keep on just doing the same thing and like manufacturing, it will get better. But you can also recombine different innovations in new ways, and the power of increasing networks, what's called Metcalfe's law, mean you get increasing advantage. So the more connected we are, the more powerful your network. And that's led to a change. It changes the way we look at the world, our beliefs, our biases, our experiences. It's that social consensus is changing, and the physical world, including the physical element of cyberspace, has changed. All, arguably, really, since 2007, the beginning of the second half, when the first version of this thing came out. Because actually, Steve Jobs recognized they had something and they would just build upon it and gradually do things better with it. So there's a huge opportunity. So if you look at your fiduciary duties, the long-term success of your firm, you need to understand this. But in understanding it, you need to understand there's a poison fruit element. You can gorge yourself on this, and there are huge opportunities. But we've created a cyber-enabled and cyber-dependent landscape, which has a physical element, has a networks element, information, personas, real people, and social interactions. And professional and social is increasingly merging into one. And all these connections and dependencies are effectively making the world less stable, more volatile, less certain, more uncertain, less simple, more complex, and less clear and more ambiguous, what's sometimes called VUCA. Concept that was first brought about in the late 90s because people could see this was the coming age. And this is what we've got. And all these things then create opportunities for the cyber threat to trust. Because increasingly, I can pretend to be something else, be that technically or in person. What's called technically spoofing is all about, are you who you say you are? Are you authentic? Go back to trust properties. It allows people to tamper with information, to tamper with networks, to change the integrity. We're about to have a US election. Election integrity. Where's the misinformation, the disinformation that's going around? Have people altered votes? That campaign that people are trying to sow those seeds of mistrust, or is already out there. Repudiation. Can I, not only I believe that this Catherine's telling me the truth, but can Sean believe that Catherine's telling me the truth? Non-repudiation, effectively social trust. What about confidentiality? We're increasingly holding confidential information. Every organization has its secrets, including the secrets it holds potentially for other people. So is that being challenged? are our services actually going to be available when we want them to the standard we want them? We've moved on, hopefully, from the blue screen of death, but that does still happen. But now, it'd be there. And ultimately, are the right people being given the right privileges, the right authorizations to do what's necessary? And that changes the power structures from not always the boss being the person who's got the greatest power in this area, but the IT admin. And do you really understand what they're doing on that? So we tend to talk about in security about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad. But linked to that is authenticity, non-repudiation, and authorization. And these are all potentially going to be subverted by accident or by design to cause a challenge to the trust to your firm. So your great strategy to digitize and provide wonderful services to your customers might all be undone because somewhere along the line, by accident or by design, things have gone wrong. And this is where we talk about what's known as the Swiss cheese model. So all people are inherently flawed. Last person who claimed not to be lived about 2,000 years ago. Okay. We are all flawed. We are all capable of being manipulated. What in the cybersecurity world is called social engineering. In the old world was called con artists. All data and technology is flawed or capable of being made flawed. All has holes. All policies and processes are flawed and can be created flawed. All your facilities and your underlying infrastructure is flawed and can be. And all your suppliers reflect all of those as well. And if you are a supplier, that's what your customers are increasingly going to think about you. And all it takes is the lining up of those holes to a greater or lesser extent to create a disruption. And the evidence of that is overwhelming. It happens every day. Remember, as much through accident and hazards than it is by design of malicious actors. But there are malicious actors who are wanting to do this as well. Sometimes they're not targeting you, but they may go via you to get to somebody else that you're connected to, or you just happen to be collateral damage and they don't care. So all of these things are the nature of the digital age that we are living in. So some areas of risk and some examples to think about. Government figures in 2022, approximately 750,000 breaches of the Computer Misuse Act in the UK alone. Okay. And that's cyber-enabled crime and cyber-dependent crime. So what's the difference? Cyber-enabled crime is crime. Old-fashioned crime just happens to use that. So fraud. Fraud is fraud. It just increasingly is cyber-enabled. Probably the most high-profile cyber-enabled fraud this year is a construction company called Arab, big multinational. They were defrauded circa 25 million US dollars on one Teams call, where it is claimed there was one person in finance, senior finance person, and everyone else on that Teams call were AI generated entities. And they persuaded said individual to make a $25 million transfer. Okay. Now, interestingly, I was talking to someone the other day who is exceptionally cynical, and he was saying, well, actually, the fraud might be him in the first place, covering his tracks. But here's where we are into ambiguity, and where you've got to investigate and have the mechanism to investigate on these things. So cyber-enabled crime is where most crime now occurs. Yes, you can get beaten up walking down the street, but that actually is relatively rare these days, fortunately. But everybody is subject to this sort of potential fraud. Whether it's an email that says, click on this link, and that will then take you through, or some sort of sophisticated fraud like that. And AI, remember, we're just entering really useful AI territory now, and it's only going to get more, is going to supercharge this. But it's still fraud. And it's still cyber-enabled crime. Okay. Then we have certain cyber-dependent crime, i.e., it's a crime that could only take place as a result of computers and technology. So this is hacking. This is the Computer Misuse Act, illegal entry and manipulation of computer systems and networks. This is denial of service attacks, sometimes botnets and things like that. This is ransomware, which is a form of extortion, but it's very much in that. And the number one cybercrime of the day is ransomware, which is normally facilitated by some form of social engineering as part of that. So all of these are risks, and those risks are rising. Some are new risks manifesting themselves in new ways. Some of them are completely new risks, all using technology. So the bad guys have a vote in this. And we have a vote and need to use technology as well as people and processes and our organizations to counter it. Now, everybody is a supplier and has suppliers. And your supply chain is where a lot of this occurs. Whether you are the supplier to someone bigger who is the ultimate target, and that is increasingly done, especially by more sophisticated actors, or whether you are reliant on parts of the supply chain. So people outsource services. Capita last year ransomed policyholders in pension. They do pension outsourcing for services. Pensioners hit by it. The ransom group didn't care. Vulnerable customers, they're vulnerable people. Yeah, we'll stop them having their pensions paid, amongst many other outsourced services that Capita do. That's why there is increasing emphasis on assurance of your critical suppliers. So I'm currently sitting in an office in one of the banks. At the moment, I spend a lot of time assuring suppliers. But it's not just that. There's a software supply chain. We all use software. This call is enabled by multiple levels of software. Software is targeted. So two well-known examples, SolarWinds, huge operation by the Russians through a supplier to get to what they were really interested in, which was national security and defense contractors, and parts of government. But actually, thousands of organizations were impacted by that. So what they effectively did was, over about 9 months, slowly infiltrated this software that allowed them increasing access into people's systems remotely. And it was only picked up not by the supplier, but by a cybersecurity company that used the supplier's software. And they suddenly started seeing things being exfiltrated from their systems because they were really looking for it. CrowdStrike, you probably heard about that. So this is where the cybersecurity company got it wrong, the non-malicious accident. And because of the way cybersecurity software tends to work, it has to get right at the kernel, the heart of software and systems, it caused catastrophic problems. It was just a bad process that they did. But that took out, that's arguably the largest software-based incident ever. Over 8 million machines taken out. Airlines not able to operate, things like that. All because of a series of Swiss cheese accidents. Not malicious. Then we have digital infrastructure. So a lot of the internet effectively runs on what are called code libraries, which is just building blocks software that just helps run things. So again, earlier on this year, about 80% of open source software is managed by volunteers. Think about that. Unpaid volunteers who are getting older. One of these volunteers was socially engineered over a period of 2 years. And eventually what's been attributed to a Russian hacking group took over that software and were about to effectively infect most of the internet with a tool that would have given them access to any organization. It was stopped by another volunteer who spotted it. Very close near miss. And then there's hardware. Most Apple products made in China. US government are seriously considering banning Russian Chinese components from electric vehicles and other key parts of the critical infrastructure. We have infrastructure, hardware with components that we don't know where they're from properly across our things. Who has an e-cigarette and charges it in their device, in their laptops through the USB portal, or has someone in the office that does that? Where have they got that e-cigarette from? What's the supply chain of that? But that's a well-known vector to put malware into people's computers. We've just had, this year, there's been 2 botnets that have been taken down by the Americans. The most recent one last week, called Raptor Train botnet, where routers, home cameras, things like that, all made by a Chinese manufacturer, had malware implanted in it, which was enabling botnets, which effectively allows you to do those distributed denial of service attacks. They take up the computing power and then allow that to all go ahead. So this is everywhere. This, no one and your average organization cannot be on top of all this. So we have to be aware of it. And so there are 2 certainties in life. Used to be death and taxes, and I'm sure they still apply. But it's now disruption and legislation. So those of you who remember the Mueller inquiry about President Trump and potential Russian interference, he used to be the FBI director, and he came out with 2 types of companies: those that have been hacked and those that will be. It will happen. Regulatory wise, One of the reasons why I'm sitting in a bank at the moment, they have operational resilience regulations, which are mainly around cyber, not exclusively. And they work on the principle, assume when, not if, things will go wrong. And be clear about what's important, your important business services. Okay? This is the new mindset to adopt and to work through. And that means legislation is changing. We're all aware of GDPR, and you might be aware of the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, which is cookies and things like that. The new government picked up what the last government were doing, repackaging it, slightly different thing, but there's a Digital Information and Smart Data Act. Digital verification services. Remember, authenticity. Are you who you say you are? Effectively a digital ID card that will be used to verify your employees. So we're getting into other areas, for employment purposes. Smart data schemes, better sharing of data, the opportunity, better support of scientific research in this area, but also upgunning the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, so that they've got even stronger powers. There is also what's called the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. Now, this is building on a piece of legacy EU regulation called the Network Information Security Regulation Directive. They've just updated theirs. We're about to do the same. Expansion of scope, firms that are going to be involved. More regulatory powers. You're getting the pattern. And more increased instant reporting. This is not going away. It's the hard trend is there. How that's going. And if you manufacture things, there's now the Product Security and Telecommunications Act. In the EU, they have the Cybersecurity Act. So your smart devices, your smart teddy bear toy that you now manufacture is going to start having to meet certain minimum cybersecurity standards. Because believe it or not, smart teddy bears have been used to hack into organizations. So, some final thoughts. Love reality. Ask yourself, do you go about a compliance view that's a tick box? They've got this certification, they must be all right. Okay. Certification is great. I work for I'm a member of various British Standards Institute panels on good practice and the like standards. They're great. Highly recommend them, but they're not the be all and end all. What do you do to actually validate that you've got a meaningful capability to protect yourself, to detect potential threats, and importantly, to be able to respond and recover if the worst happens? Do you love reality? Have you woken up and seen that? I suspect you're beginning to, because you're on this webinar. Do you understand the risk? We've all got biases. Just because it's not happened to you doesn't mean it won't. And just because something has never happened in the way that you think it could be, doesn't mean it won't. Remember, people make mistakes, and the bad guys have a vote in this. And they will try and subvert to get to where they want. And going back to the strategy piece, strategy is 95% implementation. You need a framework of guiding principles based on an understanding of what's going on, but you've then got to drive it through. And that's implementation is always going to be different because it's your firm, not the next guys or girls. Okay. And ultimately, are you cyber trustworthy? Because when the ICO comes knocking, when a cyber security and resilience regulator comes knocking, if that's applicable, when shareholders come knocking, when the police come knocking, when the law courts and you're being sued, they will all say, did you do credible, authentic, and competent things, both pre and post a disruption. The ICO has fined law firms for not having basic cybersecurity measures in place, even though they've been the victim of a ransomware. Because they said, these are the basics, you should be doing this. If you're not doing this, this is irresponsible. This is leaving your door open. So, next steps, action this day. What are you going to do? Questions?
Thanks, Richard. I think everybody's suitably terrified. I saw Beth and Sean taking lots of notes during that presentation there. And one of my questions for you was linking to upcoming legislation. So thank you very much for covering that off. And you also had some really excellent examples of where people have been caught out or maybe not kind of, I suppose, covered the basics. I was going to say covered their asses, but that's maybe not the right terminology to use. Do you have any examples of some organisations that are ahead of the curve, and can we illustrate those that have maybe gone through the process and the training and maybe just to kind of create a bit of relevance for us all?
So the sector that is probably most generally is anything to do with financial services, because their regulators are all over them. And this is why there is a regulatory push. And it's not just in the UK. The EU has parallel and in some ways even more, and including on the AI. And the US is going that way and other parts of the world. From personal example, I have a fintech client who one of their suppliers was ransomed a couple of years ago because they'd been through the training and because they had then taken appropriate measures. They're in a very time-sensitive trading environment. They were up and running within 10 minutes because they had alternative fallbacks ready to film. All their competitors were down for hours, and this is a business where literally minutes can be measured in thousands. Sure.
Beth, absolutely feel free just to come in and ask your question.
Yeah, is that all right? Sorry. I think what was so good about today is that we talk about cybercrime. I think one of the problems that we have is that in some ways, if, like you were saying, if we go down the street and we're mugged, we're a victim. Everyone feels sorry for us who've got a black eye. If we've been outsmarted, or that's how we feel by a cybercrime, it's almost like an attack on our intelligence. And I was just wondering, if you do any other talks with like sort of teams, just to get teams talking about these things, as if to appreciate that they are a crime. It's not that they're smart crimes, but it doesn't make us stupid. We just need to wise up to these crimes, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I chair an industry cyber working group, and we get a sort of quarterly, 6-monthly briefing from the City of London Police, who are the national leads on this. And they're always at emphasis, you must treat people as victims on this. I'll give you an example. So firm I was working with suffered a chunky cyber-enabled fraud. Payment, very sophisticated, done over a period of about 6 weeks, where a legitimate payment to a law firm was sent to a different account. And the lady in accounts was socially engineered. And we looked at logs of emails and things like that. Really interesting. And you could see all the techniques that were being applied in different emails over time. Now, we, myself and the Chief Information Security Officer of that firm, we treated that lady as a victim. We took action to educate her what to look forward to, how she'd been manipulated, the sort of techniques that have been done. Now, the risk department did your classic lessons learned. Yeah, these controls weren't in place. They hadn't done this. You know, there should have been a second person to authorize this payment. All that really good stuff. But they took no account of the victim. 4 months later, the same person was able to spot pretty well the same fraud and stop it there and then. Education is low cost, high impact. And it's one of the things we cover on the main course is what are the questions you should be asking? What's the culture, the attitudes and behaviors you need to establish? And what's the governance framework you need to have? And if you get it right for cyber resilience, it's the same culture, the same attitudes and behaviors, knowledge and skills that you need to innovate. This is an innovation problem, not a security problem, because we're in a contest that's requiring constant innovation because of the exponential technologies that are being recombined and innovated with by us and by the bad guys. Look at it in that sense, not as this is a cost overhead, dull security.
Thanks, Beth. That was a really good question. Sean, I can see you're primed and ready to go.
There's millions of questions, Richard, but I think the key one for me, I work in the housing sector, and we had something similar where we had there was a number of phishing emails come in, but effectively what it was for a supplier, a building company, and over a period of time we'd released £1,000. They went up in incremental stages until one point we let £35,000 go. But it was obviously with the finance department, it was they'd obviously changed the bank details, but they'd used the same sort of invoice, and the learning from that was obviously picking up. But obviously, an organisation had to do the what was it, the stages, and what was the checks and boundaries we were putting in place as well. And certainly, we have been subject to that a couple of times recently, but we've been, because we put these checks and boundaries, and because the staff members went through that process, they were able to identify that. But it's constantly, even within this housing sector now, there's more and more of these things happening where I'm conscious of the cost as well, because obviously a lot of community-based housing associations have a turnover of maybe £2-3 million, and they'll have an IT person, they'll have a third-party IT organisation. But I think that this is something that's starting to evolve even more now because of that. People trying to, fraudulently get payment of invoices using various whatever they do. This one in our own situation, our own RSL, was that it was the police had managed to trace it. It came from Vietnam somewhere. But again, there's no way you're getting that cash back. But the thing I was going to ask, I was quite interested about the use of the Chinese, component parts. Is that something that the UK government will actually look at as well, because of the keys and infrastructure projects, and we've had things about allegations involved in electoral fraud and all that sort of stuff as well, manipulating data. Is that something the UK government will look to enact? And the second part of that question is, what does the West do as going forward if we decide that there's too much a risk now using Chinese chips and other kind of parts of that? Where do we go to actually try and get that manufactured elsewhere now, which is more safe and secure?
Yeah, so the UK government has been taking this seriously for a very long time. The National Cybersecurity Centre used to have a specific centre called the Huawei Security Centre. So Huawei, huge Chinese manufacturer, probably got to where it has by a combination of state subsidy and commercial spying to steal technology, and a lot of very hard work. Be in no doubt, this is also a very innovative company. The concern with the Chinese is because it's a communist country and the actual laws they have, effectively, the Chinese can turn around to any Chinese company and say, do what we expect you to do. So in the US at the moment, there is a court case where TikTok is trying to on their owners, ByteDance, are trying to stop the Americans from saying you must sell this to a Western owner, because there is this concern of manipulation. Do you change the algorithm so only the right Chinese Communist Party friendly TikTok messages come up? There was a girl a few years ago who, during a sort of beautification tutorial, said, by the way, there's slavery going on in China, and literally just slipped it in like that to get past the algorithms. So yeah, there's huge amounts of work. This is the one bit of bipartisan politics in the US is the threat from China. We are in a world that's not like the Cold War of 1945, because China is central to the global economy. Supply chains are incredibly complex, but the US, the UK, Europe, the West in general, we are going through a period of probably the next 10 years where supply chains are going to be restructured. So there's huge opportunities in the green transition. That's not only a necessity from a climate change perspective, but actually that potentially changes the way our supply chains will work, and potential reshoring and nearshoring elements in the manufacturing. But that's not a simple thing. So the challenge from the current government is, you want to do this. Do you buy the cheaper Chinese stuff today, or invest in UK and allied countries who can provide the same technology for a greater price? And that's the dilemma. And business is about navigating dilemmas, and this is all part of that dilemma. But we can talk. There's a entirely different thing on the geopolitics and the poly crisis that we're dealing with on that.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
I'm just going to jump in very quickly because I'm super conscious of time, and I promised I would keep it to the hour. Thank you both for joining in this session and for asking such pertinent, relevant questions. I think, Richard, this gives you an indication of why this is so important, and we get the message out to our members. If it's okay with you both, we will contact you with further information about the course that we're going to be hosting. It will be in Glasgow in February. And there is a cost to attending the course. We have a limited number of spaces, but the whole purpose of this session was just to plant a seed with people, get them thinking about how critically important this is. If you're talking to other IOD members, please make them aware of this wonderful session that we have recorded and will be available for people to watch back. But the plan is to test this out, and hopefully we'll be able to roll this out as something that the IOD offers UK-wide going forward. So thank you both very much for joining today, and we will be back in touch. Richard and Irene will have a debrief and a next steps conversation to look at getting the marketing and promotion out for the course. But thank you both for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It was a brilliant session.